Hello world, my name is David Oze, and in this channel we talk about how to create and integrate APIs so you can improve your existing applications. Today we want to have a quick overview of what an API is. First thing first, we would like to discuss the definition. API stands for Application Programming Interface. It is a set of rules and protocols for building and interacting with software applications. So we understand that when building and interacting with an API, there are some set of rules and protocols that we need to follow. And in the coming slides, we will be discussing some of them. Next, we have the purpose. And the question here is, why do we need an API inside our application? So simply because we may need to add some more functionalities or features into our application, and we do not want to build, a feature from scratch. And we can just, use a third-party system. We can use a different system and just integrate it to, ease the process of adding more features. And an example can be that you want to add a payment system into your e-commerce website, for example. And in that case, you can just, communicate with that payment gateway in order to get the feature to be implemented inside your application. So that's when, using APIs come into the picture. So it simply allows different software systems to communicate with each other. Next, we have some types of APIs here. First, we have the web APIs, which are simply APIs hosted on the web. So they are APIs which are accessible through the web, and usually we make use of endpoints instead of in order to interact with those endpoints. Next, we have the library-based APIs, which are just like web APIs. And the difference here is that we will be provided with some, a library that we need to install inside our project in order to communicate with that API. And I want us to jump into the OpenAI documentation so we can clearly see the difference between web APIs and library-based APIs. So here is the OpenAI API documentation, and we can scroll down to the quick start language selection. So we are given with three options here. We can choose the first one, which is curl client URL. Let's scroll down a bit. We have some information here, like the endpoint given HTTPS, and this is the main information that we need in order to interact with this API. And apart from the endpoint, we are also given some headers here and another one here. So all these information are crucial, and they are, this is, I can say this is the main approach or the first approach through which we can interact with this OpenAI, API. And the second approach will be using one of the library provided here. So I'm gonna select Node.js and let's see what we have. We have some import. This looks more logical. This is actually a source code. We have some import OpenAI from OpenAI right here. And this is exactly what we call library-based API because we need to install this library, OpenAI, and once installed in our project, we can just do this import OpenAI so we can add this library inside our project. And once added, we can just copy and paste this block of code, and this will ease the process of implementing this API inside our project. Back to our presentation to understand our last type of API. Simply put, when you want to create an Android application, you may need to, add some features like file access or camera, all the features that you may want to, integrate inside your application. In that case, you need to make use of the operating system APIs so that you can easily communicate with those APIs and add a feature, for example, of file accessing or camera accessing and stuff like that. Everything related to the operating system is going to be implemented into your application using some API which is provided by the operating system. We would like to discuss the API architectural styles, and the first one and the most used nowadays is the REST, which is representational state transfer. So using REST, we can make a post request in order to create some resource. We can make a GET request to get some data from the server. We can make an update request, a put request. We can make a delete request in order to delete some resources. So all these are called HTTP methods, and this is the first and most used approach. Um, when it comes to integrating an API into your software. So the second approach, which is becoming more and more, common out there, is the query language and server-side runtime for APIs, which is nothing but GraphQL. And the power of GraphQL is that we can, specify the type of data that we want from the server. We can, specify the format in which we want to receive the data, and it makes it very, neat to kind of make requests to the server and then expect the data the way you have requested them. And let's take a look at the clear difference between REST and GraphQL to better understand this. So with REST, we can make a request using an endpoint. As you can see the example, we have this, JSON format data. It's a response which we have received from the server, and in this response, we have no way to tell the server when making the request. I mean, we have no way of telling the server that this is the data that we want, or this is how we want them to be formatted. But when using REST, we can just expect the data the way the server has formatted them. And on the other side, working with GraphQL, we can actually, specify the data that we want. We can specify the format in which we want the data to, to appear when we get them, and as we can see, we have first name and last name requested, and that's exactly the only information that we get in the response. So GraphQL gives more flexibility in the request than REST, but REST is easier, and mm, I think it's easy to use and easy to integrate and to work with. It's actually quick to set up and just get things to work. Next, we want to discuss the webhook. Webhooks are also called callback, and they are simply post requests. And how do we understand this? Like, let's say in your integration, in your payment system integration, you want to get a response from the server every time. For example, let's say every time a payment is successful. So in your application, you want to set up some kind of interaction with the server every time a user makes a successful payment. And in that case, you may need to provide some URL to the server. And every time there is a successful, transaction, you are going to get a request, a post request, which contains some payloads or some data from the server, and then you can do anything you want with those data. So it's very good to um, see it practically inside an example, inside a project, so we really understand how it works. So we need to have a good knowledge of these concepts when working with APIs. And endpoints, authentication, authorization parameters are going to be discussed in the coming slides. We want to focus on headers first of all and body. So headers are just additional information that we need to, mention in our request. Sometimes compulsory to be mentioned before sending the request. So headers are simply additional information, and the main information are going to be, mentioned inside the body. And the body is usually formatted in a JSON format, and we will have to mention all the required information before sending the request. That's called the request body, but there is also what we call the response body, and the response body is nothing that the JSON format we get as a response from the server. So apart from this, we should also have a good control over status codes. We have the 200 code, which is okay. The request went well. 201, which will mean created. So this happens usually when we make a post request. We have this status code as a response from the server. And the 404 will be the page not found or the endpoint not found, which we've seen around on the web. The 400 will be bad request, so maybe some missing information in the headers or in the body. So if things are not well mentioned, specified, then we will get this status code as a response from the server. We have the 401, which means not authorized. So it may happen that you do not have the authorization to access some endpoint. And in that case, you get this status code as a response from the server. You have the 429, which means too many requests. So it happens also that maybe you are allowed to make a certain amount of requests in a minute, and you made too many requests in a minute, and then the server can't handle those and just fire and we'll just respond. We just respond with this 429, which means too many requests. And it's always good to refer to the documentation so you can check and make sure that you know exactly the number of requests you are allowed to make in a minute or in a second. And last, we have the 500, which is just the internal server error, which means something went wrong in the server. We don't know exactly what happened, but something just went wrong. So next, endpoint. So in an endpoint, we have a protocol which can be HTTP or HTTPS. We have the domain name, which is just the name of our API provider. We will have the version and the resource, which is the resource we are interacting with. It can be users, for example, here. And when making a GET request, for example, we're going to get all the users or a list of users from the server. And if you want to get, for example, one particular user, which is identified by its ID, then we may need to send a parameter when making the request. And that parameter will be an ID. So sometimes it may look like a slash ID, and other times we'll have like a question mark, then ID is equal to some value. Okay, so very good to understand what goes on inside an endpoint. And next, we want to discuss the authentication. So it's good to understand the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication simply means that we need to verify the identity of a user. So when we log into a platform on the web, we are usually requested to, mention our email address and password. And when we do that, we actually allow the system to verify, to kind of confirm that it's really us trying to log in. And once the system confirm, we have access to our feed and also this is what happens on the web. But working with APIs here, we're going to get a sort of JWT. It's a JSON Web Token, just a long list of character, which is going to be a way that our API provider is going to verify our identity. So that means every time we make a request to the server, we need to mention our JWT. Sometimes it can be an API key, which is a UUID. So we just need to mention that, UUID, that set of digits, that set of characters, so that the server knows that, okay, we are the one making the request and the request will be granted, the access, whatever, will be granted, and then we can have the data that we requested. So that's for authentication. But what happens is we can be authenticated, but still not authorized to access some routes, because authorization means what resources the user have access to. So a simple example can be that I am using a website, I have access to the front part of the website or to the front end, but I'm I am not authorized to have access to certain routes. So when trying to get access to have access to some routes, I have like a page telling me that okay, I'm not authorized. So in that case, that's what we call authorization. So you can still be authenticated inside a website. You can have access to some routes, but since you're not authorized to access the admin area, for example, you will not have access to the admin area. That access will be only, granted to admin users. So it's very important to understand this too, because when working with APIs, especially when building APIs, you need to set an authentication system. You need to set some authorization system for some users who may be authorized to access some part of the API and others not. So that being said, that's all for me, and I'll see you in the next one.